Okay, maybe are we good to start?
Good if you are.
So thank you all very much for coming. First of all, thanks very much to the Four College EDI Fund for funding the whole thing. So that's like Oriel, Christchurch, Corpus and Unit. And so together they've put together this fund to enable us to have EDI events like this. And so I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Hannah Barham-Brown, who has done many things in her life. So she started off with a degree in English and theology with Arabic at Durham, with the idea of becoming a war correspondent, and then decided not to be a war correspondent, instead maybe to be a paediatric nurse. So off she went to do paediatric nursing, and then decided actually the answer was to become a GP. So off she went to postgraduate medicine and is now a GP registrar. Alongside all of that, which is an amazing amount, she's deputy leader for the Women's Equality Party, and just last week won 10% of the vote in the North Yorkshire by-election for the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. And so we're delighted to have Hannah here today to talk to us about her experiences as a disabled woman in medicine and all that entails. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm going to take the mask off if that's okay, because otherwise I can't hear myself think. So hello, it's lovely to be here. It's really lovely to see actual people in front of me when I give a talk. I've spent a year looking at little grey circles on Teams, dying a bit inside. So, you know, although all I can really see are your eyes, they're still lovely eyes. So thank you. So yeah, I'm Hannah Barham-Brown. It's lovely to be here. If anyone would benefit from a visual descriptor, I'm a white woman with crazy red hair, wearing a slightly ludicrous boiler suit, and I'm sitting in a red power chair. So you've heard a little bit about my slightly unorthodox journey to wherever it is I am now, and that seems to change on an almost daily basis. But I wanted to kind of like talk you through a little bit of the route I took and the things I've learned along the way, and some of the lessons I now try and bring to my daily practice as a GP and as a campaigner and a politician and all of the other stuff I get up to. So I have what is called a portfolio career. Normally as a GP, you can only be a portfolio GP when you're qualified. I'm still a year off fully qualifying, and well, I just like to mess with the NHS and see what I can get away with. So, as you've heard, I started off doing a degree in English and theology with Arabic. I'm going to stand up and have a bit of a wander out, if that's okay, because I have been sitting down for a long time. I'll explain that bit in a minute. So, I went to Durham to do English and theology with Arabic. I actually went to do theology and then decided that it sounded quite dull. I'm a vicar's kid, so so I did English and theology with Arabic. I was going to be a war correspondent. I've got it all planned out. And my mother, and I quote, I was non-disabled at this point, said, "You can't do that because you'll get shot and end up in a wheelchair." The irony of this is now not lost on me, but I am not a war correspondent. I'm very disappointed about that. But simultaneously, probably the best bet. So I went to Durham, had a great time, didn't do much work, shockingly, 3-4 hours contact time a week, it was great. And then I had that moment of crisis of what the hell do you do with a degree in English and theology with Arabic if you're not going to be a war correspondent? And during my time at Durham, in my final year, my mother had baby number 4, which led to some interesting conversations in the Cathedral Close. Dad's a vicar, and I had to come to terms with the fact that yes, my parents were still having babies when I was 21. It was awkward. And Theo was born. Theo had Down syndrome, and Theo was very sick. He spent the first 12 weeks of his life in intensive care at Addenbrooke's in Cambridge. And so I was doing my finals, dashing between Durham and Cambridge, and apparently revising on the train. And I just remember sitting in this neonatal unit next to my mum. Quite a few people thought that I was mum. Awkward. And watching this amazing team of nurses and doctors caring for these babies, some of which were like this big. And I realized that they weren't only caring for the babies, but they were caring for us. They were caring for my 46-year-old mum who'd spent like 3 days in intensive care. They were caring for me, trying to dash up and down and pass some exams. My dad, who was still trying to work, my other brothers. They were caring for all of us as a unit and doing so much was like, I had no idea that that's what medicine could be. I had no idea that that's what healthcare was. I just thought you went in, you were given drugs, you left again. And so I thought, right, okay, I think I want to be a doctor. I have no science A-levels. I still have no science A-levels. And so I'm sitting here listening to people talking about weighing mice and doing DPhils, and I'm just like, okay. And so I had no idea how I was going to do this. But in those days, you used to get tuition fees paid and a bursary if you went into nursing. So I phoned up University of Northumbria, my parents ended up moving to Newcastle, long story, and said, right, I've got a BA in English and Theology with Arabic. What do I need to do? I don't have any science A-levels. Can I come and study paediatric nursing? It was that one, midwifery and catching babies terrified me. I was determined I was going to drop one, so I went for paediatric nursing. And they were like, right, do you have a GCSEC in maths? So, yeah, got that. Do you have any A-levels? Yeah, got that. Great, you've got an interview in 3 days. Okay, so I ended up doing paediatric nursing, which was wonderful, and it meant that I could help care for Theo, my baby brother, because my mother is also a wheelchair user. Careful. She has a neurological condition. Her brain and her legs had a bit of a falling out around the age of 11 and haven't really spoken since. And so I did this nursing degree. It was great. Can't say I worked massively hard for that either, but it was entertaining. And I finally got to spend some time in the hospital and was sitting going, still really want to be a doctor. Still don't have any science A-levels. I eventually did a postgrad course, got in to med school at St George's in London. Very lovely. If you've ever seen 24 Hours in A&E, that was me. I worked in that A&E, it was very nice. And as I was doing this medical degree, it was all going quite well, surviving London, all great, feeling very old. There was a lot of 18-year-olds on the course. And my eldest brother, Gareth, no, it's a dance child. My eldest brother, Gareth, had a heart transplant when he was 14. If anyone here works in genetics, you're currently doing a lot of like maths going, what the hell is, yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, my brother had a heart transplant when he was 14. And by the time I got to medical school, he'd had his new heart for about 9 years. And in my penultimate year, his heart began to fail. This happened, he had 9 years and was in the process of being relisted for a new transplant. And then he developed sepsis, and Gareth died in the early hours of Boxing Day. So that was a bit rubbish. And I did that medical thing, quite similar to that academic thing. I went straight back to university. And I carried on and I cracked on, it was all fine. And I decided the way I was going to process all this grief that was just absolutely consuming me was that I was going to run a half marathon for the British Heart Foundation. What you need to know about how well that half marathon went is that I bought a wheelchair within a year. So I was diagnosed, I started running, and my right kneecap kept kind of going all the way around the back of my leg. It hurts. Just FYI, and if I give you no other medical advice for the next 20, 30 minutes, if your kneecaps dislocate when you run, that is probably a sign you should stop running. I did not pay any attention. I just popped it back in and carried on running. And it was just getting worse and worse. I managed to do the half marathon. And within a couple of months, I bought my first walking stick because things weren't getting better and it was dislocating more and more, and the joints were starting to misbehave. Nobody could really work out what was going on. My poor GP was just baffled. And I had a rheumatology lecturer who we were doing hand exams and we were practicing, bending all the fingers. Just like, your fingers are really bendy. So, yes. She's like, is the rest of you really bendy? So, well, I did ballet for 15 years. I'm now 27 and I can still do the splits. And yeah, things keep dislocating. It's really weird. Now, at medical school, there's this joke that every week, every medical student diagnoses themselves with something weird and wonderful. We're all massive hypochondriacs. I am the only medical student I know who got it right. I diagnosed myself with something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and yeah, I got it. So Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a collagen disorder. It's systemic. It affects, collagen makes up quite a lot of your body, your gut, your eyes, your skin, blood vessels. It can affect that, muscles, joints, tendons, all of this sort of stuff. So that's why my jokes like to party, and often it starts to really present in the kind of late 20s. It can be like triggered off by an infection, we think, or particular fatigue, stress. Dead brother will probably do it. So mine got worse and worse. And by the end of medical school, having gone in relatively fit and healthy and doing exercise, I graduated in a wheelchair. They'd never had anyone graduate in a wheelchair before, and that made graduation all the fun. Trying to work out how to deal with chairs and gowns is always quite entertaining. So I graduated and suddenly realised I was going into a profession and I'd never seen a wheelchair using doctor before. I didn't know whether we existed, and I couldn't really find any, except for Twitter. Twitter, everyone's on Twitter. It's great, highly recommend. If you're on there, I'm Dr Hannah BB, say hi. So I started to kind of like build these contacts and work out what I was doing, but I had no idea how I was going to have a medical career. I had to crowdfund my first wheelchair because I couldn't practice without it. And wheelchair funding in the UK is basically a massive postcode lottery. So I'd crowdfunded my first chair in order to be able to qualify, and now here I was trying to work full time because nobody told me you could work part time as a doctor in training. I don't know. And I was getting more and more broken and more burnt out. And in my final year of medical school, there was this small minor junior doctor contract dispute. You might remember it, a few protests, a bit of striking. Turns out I'm really good on a picket line because I bring my own chair. So I'd kind of got quite involved in that, doing a lot of like media and stuff around it, because once upon a time I was going to be a war correspondent, so I'm okay with talking to the media. And somebody from the British Medical Association had come up to me, this guy called Jeeves Vijayasuriya, who was chair of the junior doctors at the time, came up and said, you should come and work with us and do some stuff with us. And I told him where to stick it. I was not interested. I had no interest in trade unionism. I didn't really know what it was. I just quite like talking to cameras. And within 6 months, I was deputy chair of the junior doctors committee and Jeeves was my boss. So that went well, but it meant that I got to start learning about how working as a doctor works. Started helping negotiate contracts, started looking at the well-being of our staff. My priority, I was deputy chair for professional issues, and that meant that I did lots of surveys on things like well-being amongst junior doctors. Spoiler alert, well-being of junior doctors is in the pan. It was in the pan before the pandemic. Just terrible. But it meant I started to kind of understand some of the structures we had in place to support and that we didn't have. So at the moment in most specialties in medicine, if you want to work less than full time, you have to have a specific reason. And those reasons can include caring for a child or relative or ill health. And you can sometimes do it if you're doing a PhD or something like that. If you want to study alongside, you've got to apply separately. You can't just choose to work less than full time in most specialties. You couldn't really choose it at all 5 years ago. And I realized this is wrong, because in medicine, our full time is somewhat bonkers. Like, it's meant to be up to 48 hours a week. It's never just 48 hours a week. And so our full time is more than most people's full time. And given that you're making quite big, scary decisions, that's not always a very healthy place to be. And so I felt very strongly that, yes, I was very fortunate. Within a year, I'd managed to go less than full time. And because who was going to argue with this, really? I'd managed to go less than full time, but there were lots of people around me who were burning out. Like, I was finding doctors crying in linen cupboards and toilets. And they were desperate to reduce their hours. They were desperate to have some semblance of a happy family life. And they just couldn't make it work. In about 2 years' time, after lots of negotiating, every doctor in training will be able to choose to go less than full time and not need a reason. Right, thank you. It wasn't for me, but thank you. I kicked off a lot, so I'm going to take it. But all of these little things kind of added up, and I started realizing that as a disabled doctor who got all of these privileges of working less than full time, I had quite a lot of unique experience to bring. Because, yeah, there weren't many like me. It turns out there were actually quite a few wheelchair-using doctors. We just tend to stay under the wire, most of them. But we actually had quite a lot of useful experience to bring. So every year, the British Medical Association has a big annual representatives meeting where people can turn out, present motions, things they want to see change. And if it gets passed by the 400 or 500 doctors who are there, then the association has to try and work to make it happen. That becomes our policy. And it might be that we're going to lobby the government to do X, Y, Z, or it might be that we're going to do a big survey of what's available for this. Now, the first time I turned up to this meeting, somebody had put in a motion saying that NHS facilities should be wheelchair accessible. And you can see, and I'm seeing a couple of looks now going, you mean they aren't? But they aren't. So I was sitting there and he was asking, because he was a doctor, but his daughter was a wheelchair user, and he'd realised that actually he was struggling to get his daughter into appointments and to different facilities. And actually, if you're somebody that needs a changing places toilet, so one of the bigger loos with like a hoist and a kind of pull down changing table, a lot of hospitals still don't have that. John Radcliffe only got one a few years ago, I think. It's something that we're still really not managing to do well enough. And I'd turned up for my final GP placement at medical school, and I couldn't get my wheelchair into the clinic rooms without scratching all the paint off the door frames and all the skin off my knuckles. And so it's all these small things that I was able to go, yeah, actually, we've got issues here. So I started to do more and more kind of like talking and research about all the different various issues that disabled people, both using the NHS and within the NHS, face. And there are many. And having the kind of background in politics and the BMA, I was able to try raising some stuff about it. So, for example, I realised sexual health services are often not accessible. And I realised this because I tried to go to a sexual health clinic in South London 5 years ago and got there and found out it was up 2 flights of stairs. Because disabled people don't have sex. So it's fine. It's all fine. But that's the kind of attitudes that we're working with. And unfortunately, when issues like that arise, it is often because people just haven't thought, wait, what if a disabled person needs this service? Because deep down, we still think of a lot of disabled people as being fundamentally asexual, which most of us, I hate to break it to you, are not. So that's an issue. Cervical screening. At the moment, around 1% of GP surgeries in the UK have a hoist. So if I need to examine one of the 250,000 people in the UK who are hoist-dependent wheelchair users, I can't, unless I do a home visit, which I can often do, except we are not indemnified to do cervical screening in people's homes. We're not allowed to do it. And actually, I'm not allowed to do it because I'm a GP and we don't do it. The nurses do it. We have to do a whole training course. NHS, bureaucracy, we love it. But this means that we have disabled people who need cervical screening who are unable to get it. And it gets worse because I heard from this wonderful woman called Fiona, who is a disabled woman who has 2 children, and she has been sexually active at some point. So she needs cervical screening. Everyone should get it, really. And she had been getting the letters from her GP surgery, the invite letters, and tried to book it. And they said, no, we don't have a hoist, so we can't do it. And she said, well, you keep sending me the letters and I want my screening. And they said, oh, well, don't worry, just opt out of cervical screening and we'll stop sending you the letters. So she'd ended up kicking off massively, went to the muscular dystrophy charities, went to Joe Cervical Cancer Trust, who I do a lot of work with, alongside the Eve Appeal, who I'm an ambassador for. And we kind of all got together, and Joe Cervical Cancer Trust put out this big report saying that, yeah, actually a lot of disabled women are missing out on this. And the solution for most disabled people seems to be, well, we'll refer you into secondary care because a hospital will have a hoist, so we can screen you there. Anyone want to know what the current waiting list for a cervical screen in secondary care is? We're looking at years. So we've got all of these issues and no one was talking about them. No one was raising them because nobody in medicine really knew about them or acknowledged them. And so that's where I ended up setting up my portfolio career. Now, it all went a little bit haywire because, as you've heard, I'm now in politics. So I ended up, the BMA did this massive women's health report, and it's fantastic. If you want to know what medicine is like at the moment, It's hugely inequitable. We don't look after women well enough. We don't research women's health well enough. And there's a big old report that says so. I ended up doing an interview with Jenny Murray on Women's Hour, which is just as scary as you think, about this report, and was invited to speak at the Women's Equality Party conference. I went. By the end of the day, I joined the party. 6 months later, I was a council candidate, an EU parliamentary candidate, and now I'm deputy leader of the party, and I'm still not entirely sure how that happened. But it means that I've got another forum to kind of start talking about and raising this stuff. Now, why is this also important? Well, tomorrow is International Day of Disabled People, and it is currently Disability History Month. And what we tend to see is purple washing, where tomorrow, the colour of disability is purple. I quite like it because it's also one of the colours of the suffragettes. So, you know, co-branding, loving it. But we tend to see a lot of purple washing on International Day of Disabled People or International Day of People with Disabilities. It's a mouthful. We prefer disabled people. Thanks. And lots of companies will like make all these lovely kind of comments and gestures, blah, 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 and talk about how much they want to work with disabled people, blah, blah, blah. We'll see a lot of inspiration porn, which is where everyone tells us it's so very inspirational for getting out of bed and doing a job like everybody else. I just do it sitting down. And then we'll forget about it for the rest of the year, as per. And this is why I think there's a problem with that. And I'm going to address this from a financial perspective. I spend a lot of time going and talking to international businesses, telling them why they need to be nice to disabled people. And fundamentally, they care about money. So that's what I talk about. The purple pound is the amount of money that working class people with disabilities put into the economy every year. Any guesses how much that might be? Are we talking millions or billions? Billions, yes, it's 268 billion a year. And that's just the disabled people in the UK. There are 14 million disabled people in the UK. That makes up approximately 23% of the population. There are 30 million with one or more long-term health condition. So we're kind of everywhere. People often say, oh, I don't really know any disabled people. You're kind of like, do you know more than 5 people? Because if so, chances are you do. And I hate to break it to those of you wearing glasses in the room who don't think you're disabled. You take them off, you will have a substantial long-term physical impairment on your day-to-day life, which is the Equality Act 2010 definition, much paraphrased. So a lot of people have disabilities that they don't necessarily appreciate our disabilities, and there's always a moment of reckoning. And yet we as a society forget they exist. And that's not ideal. And I think it really says something when the NHS, National Health Service, forgets that disabled people exist. Because it's not just a problem for our patients, though fundamentally a lot of the people we treat have disabilities. Next time any of you are in a hospital or a GP surgery, I want you to go into the disabled loo. I'm giving you dispensation if you don't already have it. There, I have that power. Go into the disabled loo and have a look at the bin. I will bet you 9 out of 10 disabled toilets in the NHS have pedal bins. If I could use a pedal bin, I wouldn't need this. Oh boy. So we forget about all of this. And it's these little things. It's this kind of death by 1,000 cuts that as disabled people we have to live with. And it's exhausting and it's frustrating. But it also means that we treat our workforce like absolute crap. Because if 14 million people in the UK have disabilities, and that's roughly 1 in 5 of us, chances are there are quite a few of them working for the NHS. It's the 5th biggest employer in the world. We employ millions of people. Maybe not millions, a lot of people. And we are treating them like rubbish. And I know this because we did a survey in the British Medical Association. I got bored, so I did a survey. And we surveyed 700 doctors and medical students and former doctors, because quite a lot of them had left early, with disabilities and long-term health conditions. And we asked them what their experiences were like. Now, 55% of those get the reasonable adjustments they ask for. Reasonable adjustments they are entitled to by law under the Equality Act 2010. 55% of doctors and medical students get what they're entitled to. And 77% told us that they were worried about disclosing a disability because they thought they'd be treated badly by their colleagues. That's the health service. That's what we're dealing with. And then when you add on to that, we have a system for reasonable adjustments where, as a junior doctor in my first 2 years of training, I would rotate jobs every 4 years. So if I go to access to work and I say, I need a new shiny wheelchair to get around my job, please. I tried it, didn't work, but that's another story. I need a new wheelchair, fine. So they will assess me for one for that job. And some of the money is put up by the trust, the job I'm working in, for that chair. When I rotate out of that job, they get to keep the chair. And it's not just wheelchairs, hearing aids that are molded to people's ears. They are legally entitled to keep. Now we know that most people don't get the reasonable adjustments they're entitled to. If they get them at all, they don't get them within 12 weeks. If you're doing a 4-month rotation, that means if you do manage to get them in time, you're saying, hello, lovely new hearing aids, tatty bye-bye, I'm off to be a surgeon now. And then you get to go through it all over again. So there are lots of issues. And this is why I think this is really important. Now, I'm going to try and shut up shortly. I know we're on Oxford time. I've just discovered what that is. I'm very excited about it. Because I think often the best bit of these sessions is having a bit of a discussion, because I don't know anything about you. I don't know how many disabled people or people who identify as disabled are in this room. And a lot of people have a lot of questions about disability. One of the things I've discovered since gaining this thing, she's called Merida, by the way, after the girl in Brave with the big red hair. I make all of my sartorial choices based on Disney movies, Pixar actually. She's very good at hills and she's red. Okay, so I like to have a judgment-free zone at the end of my talks, because I've discovered that people are terrified about talking about disability. And one of the problems with that is that we are terrified of talking to people like me. I can roll down the street and people don't want to make eye contact with me, which is awkward because I inevitably want to roll over their toes. I sometimes do, most of the time. But we are so scared, fundamentally, of getting it wrong. People are constantly going, am I allowed to call? No. If anyone was wondering, no. It's not saying, I'm allowed to call me a crip. Nobody else is allowed to call me a crip. It's like the code. But people are really scared of getting it wrong. So I like to try and just give people an opportunity. If I'm doing PowerPoint, which I don't like doing because they're massively inaccessible, I would put up a photo of my TV fart face at this moment. Whenever I'm on TV, wherever you pause me, my face looks like it's broken in. It's a curse. And it's actually quite hilarious. It means every time I do an interview, I get a series of photos sent to me via Instagram and WhatsApp of Hannah's TV fart face. So I normally put that up to let you know that this is a safe space. But if anyone has any questions, concerns, please don't give past medical suggestions, because I'm not going to be able to help very much with those. Now is your space. And if not, I can just carry on talking. But I'd like to hear from you, because I don't know what it's like to be disabled in academia, really. So, thoughts, concerns? Terrible? Okay, why is it terrible?
I mean, I can obviously only speak for myself, but I lived my whole life thinking I was normal, and then I came to Oxford, getting diagnosed with like one huge thing after another. First, it was rheumatoid arthritis, because apparently the stress of this uni just made my joints.
Mm-hmm.
And then COVID happened, and then I found out I had ADHD.
Oh, snap! Hi!
And then this year I found out I was autistic, and Hannah, she's the nurse for Oriel. She's helped me a lot throughout the rolling out process. And Oriel also forced me to suspend my studies because I was mentally just, my mental health was too bad according to them. And yeah, so now I am suspended. I'm not allowed to be here on Oriel grounds, but I'm a rebel. So.
Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, it's been really difficult, but I think it's completely, changed my perspective on everything, like literally everything. I didn't see life in the way that I do now. Even if COVID didn't happen, like all those other things that did happen in my life would still completely up to the world, my world at least. And I think in a way the pandemic also sort of like, happened at the right time when all these things were going on in my life, because if all this didn't happen while COVID was also happening, then I would have had to suspend my studies much earlier due to the fact that, online classes physical classes were difficult because of, arthritis and stuff like that. And then, now because of COVID, people are a lot more open talking about their vulnerabilities or their struggles or their health and things like that. And assuming the pandemic didn't happen, like in a hypothetical reality, if I had to deal with all this going on in my life without coronavirus, it would have been like such an anomaly and a lot more difficult to get, access, like to request for support and things like that. And yeah, part of the reason why people are actually taking health a lot more seriously is because of COVID. And it's upsetting because a pandemic didn't have to happen for people to actually start taking all this seriously.
I'm so glad you said that. And thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I think you're right. The pandemic, I'm really glad you brought up the kind of pandemic elements of this, because I think it is a really fascinating time for disability and health anyway. Fascinating is probably the wrong word. But more widely, everyone was sort of like, yes, great, disabled people are now going to have a fabulous time because we can zoom into everything, right? And yet we're already seeing some universities and a lot of workplaces either swinging right back to where they were, and certain politicians saying we all need to get back into the office pronto because apparently it's evolution or something. I think this is the latest one. So we're now hearing, either you've got to all go back and we've got to pretend none of that happened, or we're hearing all stay at home. And for some people, that isn't ideal either. And what one would hope is that as we come out of the pandemic, we get a nice kind of hybrid model going, right? Because one of the issues a lot of disabled people have around like access and stuff has been getting reasonable adjustments, like just to get into the building. And actually a lot of employers have kind of gone, great, we don't need to make our buildings accessible now because, the wheelies can just all work from home, which is great if that's what you want to do as a disabled person. But actually, we're not thinking about the knock-on impact of that. So one of my big areas of interest is the gender pay gap, and now starting to look more intersectionally into race and disability pay gaps. We're about 5-10 years off being able to report disability pay gaps because nobody feels safe saying they're disabled in the workplace. So data is going to be a bit skewed, guys. But if you're telling disabled people that you're not going to do the reasonable adjustments because they can work from home, they're missing out on the water cooler moments. They're missing out on the promotions. They're missing out on the discussions of new roles coming up, opportunities that you just find out about. And they tend to get forgotten. And on top of that, on top of the kind of like direct earning potential element, you've also got the actual mental health element. Like, we're sociable creatures most of the time. I'm as big a fan of a sofa day in my pajamas as anyone, and I've done the last 2 days of meetings for my sofa. It's been great. But we need stimulation from other people, and I think there's kind of a forgetting that disabled people need that too. So I'm sorry that you're not meant to be here, but I won't tell anyone. I wouldn't know who to tell anyway because I'm not from here. But no, I'm sorry you've had that here because that's very disappointing. Anyone else want to jump in with anything? Yes, I'm seeing a wave. Hello.
I have a question.
Go for it. Anything you like.
Just think back with your own experience within sort of the different professions. That certainly has led to you being able to understand things and bring those experiences down and make changes within them. To what extent do you think it's important for employers and institutions to look to employees with those kind of backgrounds to suggest support, or is that placing the burden of improvement
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I don't think there is ever really a perfect answer to this, but I think the more representation you get, the better. And what we also need is representation at higher levels, because often what you find in businesses is you'll have one or two disabled people at the very lowest level of the organization. And that's it. And they're having to fight upwards, up the structures, which puts even more burden on them because they're having to ask effectively their seniors for stuff. And that makes it more difficult. So there's a report that I contributed to by Lord Shinquin, Kevin Shinquin, who's a disabled peer, called Able to Excel, which looked at the barriers to disabled people getting to board and CEO level of organizations and why it was important they did. And this is exactly one of the reasons, is because otherwise you end up placing all of the burden for the disability stuff on the 2 or 3 disabled people in an organization. And they're generally right at the bottom of the pecking order. And if we're not getting that kind of route up and in, then we're fundamentally not going to do a very good job. And if you as a business only have 2 or 3 disabled people in your entire staff, then disabled people are probably not going to want to use your products because they're probably not going to be as applicable to them as they should be. And that means you're missing out on your chunk of that 268 billion purple pound every year. So I think organizations have got a long way to go in kind of acknowledging the gaps, but also I always find it a bit bizarre that every job advert you see says that they want problem solvers and they want team workers, right? It's yes, you've got to be a good team worker and you've got to be a problem solver. Now, I don't know many problem solvers better than me when it comes to getting around London on a tube system, which I can access a quarter of. Like, if you are a disabled person and you have grown up, and let's accept the social model of disability, which says that it's society that disables us fundamentally because it's designed without us in mind. If you accept that model of disability, which most of the time I do, it needs a bit of nuancing, then we are living in that society. We are living in a place where every single day my life is harder because society has forgotten about me fundamentally, and I'm having to constantly solve problems. And I have been having to since I was disabled. I've been disabled since birth. Well, that's one hell of a work experience program. And yet companies aren't seeing those as skills. And I worked with an amazing, when I got my ADHD diagnosis, I got it about a year ago now. The company that does all the diagnosing, most of their educational psychologists and staff are themselves neurodivergent. And it was fantastic because they actually really got it. And it meant I didn't just get a diagnosis, I got somebody who really understood what it was like and who was able to point out the pros of it. And she was phenomenal. She's like, look, I've got ADHD, it's basically a superpower. Your brain, you're fantastic with deadlines, because that's the only thing I can do is work to a deadline, which is why I was scribbling notes for this talk as you all came in. But you're fantastic at deadlines. Actually, you're very good at empathy because you're constantly dealing with this kind of projection sensitivity dysphoria in the back of your head where you're so paranoid that people don't like you that you're constantly over responding to that. And that makes you a very empathetic person. You've learned to read people from basically birth. And that means you're very good at things like doctoring, where people walk in and cry on me every 10-15 minutes. It's quite exhausting, actually. But there are all of these different skills that your specific disability and condition bring you that employers should be making the most of, and they're missing out if they're not. So an organisation I work with is called My AFK, and it works with young people with learning and intellectual disabilities to get them into different workplaces. And one of the reasons they're so successful at what they do is that they've realised that it's not just a matter of finding them a job, it's a matter of using their differences and their conditions and their disabilities and what makes them them to find them the job that suits them. So for example, we have an amazing young woman called Annalise who is full-time waitress at Yo Sushi, and she has Down syndrome. And she is the most gregarious, cheerful, frankly quite exhausting young woman I've ever met. She's glorious. And everyone loves her, and she gets more tips than the rest of the staff put together. And she is so bloody good at that job. Now, if you put Annalise into a post-sorting room or put her in front of spreadsheets, she'd hate it. But actually, some of our young people who are autistic would love that, and they'd hate being in Yo Sushi. And actually, they are very, very good at those specific things because of the differences that their conditions give them. And employers are starting to learn, far too slowly, that if you kind of embrace that, you end up with somebody who's far better at the job than they would be if they were neurotypical. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but actually keep trying to push the idea that disability is an asset most of the time. You just need to know how to harness the superpower. And I really want a cape now. Yeah. So, any other thoughts, concerns, expectations?
I was going to say, there's a University there's a very powerful blog series I read about 2-3 years. At times taken on a very strange direction. I don't know how many years ago it's were anymore. But GCHQ, really celebrate that. They have this whole series of blogs which might be taken down now about people with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and how they use that in their activities.
Yeah.
But I guess the related to that is going to ask you, you've given us lots of very, very good things to talk about bad practice and cases doing things badly. Your point about the London Underground is incredibly well taken. It's something I never thought of. It's like trying to get my kids around.
Yeah.
One of my children went through a period of being very ill. Pushchair was quite a big, larger scale pushchair, and we just gave up there. Thinking, just or tackle it to drive and tackle it. I'm amazed at how much because we just gave up. So you do deserve it just for that, nothing else. But are there some examples of like companies that are doing a really good job, or organisations that are doing a really good job? But is there a kind of if there was one thing you could go into your workplace and do tomorrow, what would be the thing that you would tell people to do?
Okay. Good question. Oh, good, because I'm not sure I can narrow it down. So first and foremost, there are some companies that are doing this well, and a lot of companies are getting better at it. So I spend a lot of time slating Transport for London, shockingly. But kudos to them. I got stuck on a tube train around 2 months ago now. I actually live in Yorkshire, but I went down to London. It was my first time down for a few days, and every single journey something had gone wrong. And I was trying to get from like Canary Wharf to Green Park, and ended up couldn't get off the tube at Green Park because I got in the wrong carriage because they hadn't put any signposts as to which the right carriage was, and I ended up stuck till Wembley, just on this train. So I did what I normally do and got angry and recorded a TikTok where I'm down with the youth, and it went viral. It was very exciting. It's not normal that going viral is a good thing in my world, but it was great. And kudos to them. Transport for All found me, found my email address, and I had a meeting with the managing director within 2 weeks. And he was there saying, right, okay, what is it we could do to have made that specific journey better? And it's really simple. Firstly, co-production. So have disabled people in from very first principles. Obviously, when you're working with a 180-year-old underground system, that's not easily done. But things like you can only get on certain carriages, but you put all the stickers on the ground with the kind of disabled logo. If it's rush hour, there are people standing on them. Or they've put them really, really, really high up, and I can't see them because I'm sitting down and I'm surrounded by tall people. And it's just all of these things. So I was like, right, next time I'm in London, send me out with one of your engineers, with one of your station designers, and let's just have a roll around. And let me point out where the problems are. And actually, they've started working with a few organisations now to do that. So I think there is some good practice, but most of the time it is about disabled people and going in and yelling. But once we do that enough, they kind of catch on. In terms of the one thing that I think everybody could do in their workplace tomorrow is go and find out how many disabled people are on your staff. And you're not going to get an accurate number because a lot of people, it's the least reported characteristic when it comes to onboarding in any profession. Like, people will talk about their sexuality, their race, they won't talk about disability. But going in and asking the question of how many disabled people we have in there means that people start thinking about it, and people start asking questions about why are people not feeling comfortable. So one of the best things we've done in the NHS is every hospital now has a disability network, because nobody should be like I was 5 years ago when I started in medicine, not knowing whether there was another wheelchair doctor in the world. And these networks have enabled disabled people to come together and go, oh, you exist, and oh, look, you're there too, and actually start to work together. And so I think creating networks like that is really important. So creating networks for disabled people, or people with long-term health conditions and disabilities, however you want to phrase it, because some people don't like the word disabled, is really important. But also just asking the question, how many disabled people do we have, and what levels are they at in the organisation? And if it's massively small, if it's like single figure 1 or 2%, then you've got an underreporting problem. And we need to be looking at why people don't feel safe reporting. But by asking that first question, I think you kind of open the box a little bit. Hope that kind of vaguely answers the question. Yeah, cracking. Right, I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more. Yeah, at least Rebecca isn't chucking us out the door yet. Yes, hello.
Water had this new access center, and it's their whole thing, like, it's so accessible. And to be fair, like, they do have fully wheelchair accessible rooms. So it's very accessible for wheelchair users, but my friend is blind, and I noticed almost straight away, well, okay, there's a button to open the door, and that's great, but there's no braille on the button, and you can't just manually open the door. So, but yeah, then I brought my friend to my college, and he was like, yeah, I couldn't open that door. So it's like,
Yeah. I think it's all these little things, isn't it? It comes back to like my co-production model of disability is huge and varied. And look, I have a lot of sympathy with people trying to make accessible buildings and trying to make things more accessible. It's not easy. There is no one quick fix, because what works really well for me is not going to work for a visually impaired person. It's not going to work for a deaf or hard of hearing person. But I think that's why we need to kind of have a co-production model where we have a number of disabled people around, and actually why having something like Disability Network is so useful, because you've got a resource.
I have ADHD and autism myself, and like, I find nobody even knows what the symptoms of those are.
Oh,
so
including most doctors. I hate to break it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've had GPs turn to me going, you can't have ADHD, you're a doctor, you got through medical school. Like, but yeah, I think that's where having these kind of networks and groups are really helpful, because at the end of the day, like, we're all happy to help. I will never ever say no if somebody asks me to make a building more accessible or facilities better. And most of the time I won't even charge for it, because fundamentally it's going to make things better for me and the next person after me and the next person after that. But you just got to ask. And I think there's still that kind of pride in not wanting to admit that you might not know anything. And maybe that's one of the issues we have with academia, and certainly one of the issues we have with health, because the only difference between God and a doctor is that God knows he's not a doctor. Yeah. It's true. But yeah, so I think that's it. Yeah, that's why we have to have these networks, and we have to ask the questions and ask for help, because at the moment we're not doing it, and that's why we're getting it so wrong. Yeah. Anyone got any final thoughts that mean we can end on a slightly cheerier note? No.
I don't know if it's cheery. I just want to ask, just in general, because I come from Scandinavia, and I'm really shocked at the accessibility of everything. And I'm thinking from the streets, you know, just to walk down the street, I think about it all the time. And just for someone maybe elderly with a rollator, you know, don't have to be a full-blown wheelchair. And there's no chance. I'm thinking some streets and some villages. And it just baffles me. You surely have had the same laws that we have as EU members. So what I don't understand is, why didn't it get done here years ago? It just just feel so, I don't understand why it's been all right for a long, long time.
So
How do they get out of that? How is it not, why is it enforced? I don't understand it.
that's a good question. I think so. One of the issues we have is in terms of the law, it's a bit like the reasonable adjustments thing. The word reasonable is pulling a lot of weight. And so when it comes to buildings, roads, that sort of thing, if they can say, oh, well, it's a certain age or it's heritage or it's listed, then people see that as a reason not to do anything to make it accessible. And so it makes the process longer. And at the end of the day, unless you fight for stuff in this country, it doesn't tend to happen.
It's just stuff like, for example, the buses. I mean, every bus I know in my country, they sink, whether you need it or not. It's just that it's all done because they know sometime somewhere there will be someone with a baby or a wheelchair or related. So they have to, it's the law. And it's not based on, you know, anything else. It's the law, so it's done.
Yeah.
And this is what I just don't connect it with.
I mean, me neither to an extent. I think a lot of it, when it comes to specific transport things, my expertise is more trains because I get left on them a lot. And the excuse is they will have to do it when there are new ones brought in. So if you're if you're creating a whole new fleet of trains for LNER, which they did recently, they all have to be as accessible as possible. Now, one of the issues we have is that the main infrastructure we work within for trains and buses means that it isn't a one size fits all. So for example, if I were to get a bus from my village into the centre of Leeds, the bus stop in my village is going to be like this high off the road, and the one in Leeds might be this high. And so trying to get a bus to sync to various different levels and different heights is really difficult. So they end up having to pull out ramps, which are also right faff, and they often break. It's a bit of a nightmare. And because they're dealing with all this different infrastructure, they can't make one bus that works for all of them, is their argument. And the same with trains. All the platforms are at different levels, so we can't have automated ramps because they won't come to the right level, is the argument we hear a lot. No, me neither. And I spent a lot of time getting cross about it. But yeah, and then there's like, well, we don't have to do anything until we bring in the new set. So you don't have to go back and retrospectively change trains and coaches and buses. But if you bring in a new one, then that has to be more accessible. Yeah. It is bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. And actually, if you go to somewhere like Kensington Palace, which is about as listed as it comes, they've got these amazing retractable staircases that turn into lifts. And they've managed it. And you sit there going, there is nothing stopping you apart from money, resource, and will. But actually, you can do anything you want to make a building accessible in any building. They could make the whole of Oxford University completely accessible tomorrow if the will was there. Legally, they could do that. And it isn't about graded listing buildings, whatever. But you need the resource, the will, and the money. And we have 650 MPs in the UK, and how many of them are wheelchair users? In the House of Commons, we have 650 MPs, and none of them is a full-time wheelchair user. We have one who sometimes uses a wheelchair. And the House of Commons is not accessible. So that's why I went into politics. So yeah, we've got a long way to go.
Transport is so bad in the north. Like sometimes you can wait for a train and it will just not show up, and they will just tell you that it's gonna
This is why I just get up and drive a lot of the time. It's been a lovely drive down from Yorkshire today. Highly recommend. Cracking. I'm happy if you're happy.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
People like, I've already had questions, they were like 1 o'clock and off.
Yep, definitely. I'll hang around. Okay. Thanks, Zoom. I might be stuck on it. It's very hot table. I don't really